Hey, what's up, Liron here. If you're struggling with painting white shadows or shadows on white subjects, there we go. We're going to paint a white flower, white shadows. We're going to look at all that beautiful variety and the petals, and it's going to be great fun. Now, my quick apologies because some of the video didn't film for the background. That's actually the simplest technique, and I will explain it instead, but the important part was captured, so let's get to it. Okay, so we're going to go over the drawing process very briefly. I'm not going to get into too many details, but I'm marking essentially where the frame or the envelope around the entire flower is going to be, and then I create this oval representing where all the petals are going to go. I start putting in those leaves around it. I put in an inner oval for the inner part of the leaves, and I'm just placing the petals one by one. Now, if you want, you can get a sketch. I will link it down below and just trace after what I did, or you can recreate it yourself. Placing those petals around, making sure my proportions are all right. For now, I'm not really paying attention to light and shadow. I'm going to erase some of my prep lines. Now we're going to start establishing where the light and shadow goes. All of what you see is transitions from light to dark. Not too many smooth transitions here, so just very simple lines. Once again, if you just want to skip the entire drawing stage, simply trace based on my sketch that you can find below. And I'm going to do some very light cross-hatching just to give me some leg up when it comes to knowing exactly where the light and shadow is, so it's easier to paint. Okay, so we'll get into the process. There are some fairly interesting nuances here in the temperatures of the white shadows. The key to painting white shadows is actually seeing what colors from the environment influence them. So I personally love to choose subjects from the beginning where I can see some color within the white shadows, and then it's a matter of playing around with how saturated the color is. And for the most part, you'll find you don't want it to be as saturated. So right now I'm mixing this slightly purple because that's what I feel a lot of these petals in the middle have. Now, the purple is still quite light and also quite muted. You can go more muted than I have here. But I actually like to make some of the colors more saturated in the focal point, which is why you get that. Plus, we have these beautiful parts in the middle with the yellow, and that's going to contrast really nicely with the purple. So these are a lot of things that inform my personal decision, but of course, this will all stem, pun intended, from, well, actually not intended. This will all stem from your vision, right? The thing you want to create on paper. So right now I'm switching over to a slightly warmer neutral mix, and look at what I'm going to do. I'm going to move over to the petal underneath it, and I'm going to paint that with that middle of the road kind of mix when it comes to warmth. So I added a bit more yellow to it, just a little bit more red. I'm only using 3 primary colors: French ultramarine, quinacridone rose, and lemon yellow. Maybe a bit of new gamboge later on, so a bit of a warmer yellow. Here it is, actually, the new gamboge, but still very gentle. Now, look at what happens to the petals as the yellow from the center reflects onto them. They actually start to yellow up. So I'm actually going to take care of that center first. Very bright, beautiful yellow. Towards the bottom, it becomes a little more orange. The color actually doesn't show that well. You'll see it in the scan. It's much brighter. Not as bright maybe as the yellow in the photo, but bright enough for the context of the painting. And while this is still wet, I'm going to add that orange towards the bottom with some Pyrrole Scarlet, which I'm also using. So I'm kind of using a split primary palette. 1 blue, 2 yellows, 2 reds. Still very simple. And already you can see the trend from top to bottom, from that purpley blue all the way to a beautiful yellow. I love these kinds of transitions. This is why I chose this reference to paint. What you'll see is a lot of the highlights right now still don't have a meaning, so we're getting a partial impression. As soon as we add the dark background, which unfortunately, again, that part got cut out, wasn't filmed properly. As soon as we add that, those highlights in the middle will gain their meaning, okay? So I'm continuing with the petals here. You see that petal that is half white, half warm, cool-ish gray, actually a little more towards the blue-purple, and then I'm gonna smoothen out that edge right over there, because I feel like some leaves there's a bit more of a smooth transition, and maybe the white part isn't so clear like the one on the left, that it's very clear, the one we started with. It's very clear where the light and shadow are. This is a little more of a smooth transition, and as I move down, you'll notice there are some beautiful petals where a part is warm and a part is cool, so you can play off with that effect. Right, so from the beginning, I'm going for a thing where there is some nuance I can make use of in the white shadows, or the shadows on the white subject. Here you go, you see our yellow on the right, a little cool on the left. That's a beautiful effect. Now, if you're encountering this situation with a photo where all the white shadows feel gray, that's perfectly okay. What you can do is swatch the color in Photoshop or isolate it in a way and just figure out, is it a cool gray? Is it a warm gray? And just use that for the entirety of the shadows. It's not really, sometimes it's very easy to look at it and feel like you're overwhelmed. But if you just take a few analytical steps, first, you will be able to tell what color is there and simply paint it. White shadows are simply gray, whether it's a gray that is neutral or a gray that is more blue or more yellow, and so on. Okay, it's as easy as that. So I'm making my way around the petals. Now, one advantage to this reference photo, which is another reason why I chose it, is, and let's zoom in a bit, there's a lot of separate shapes, right? I'm making some connections, no doubt, but a lot of the shapes are separate, which allows me to work at my leisure. I can work on one petal, take my time, work on another petal, take my time, and that's a big part of it. So you're almost seeing me working with a small brush, small area. That doesn't come from the place, to me personally, of obsession with the small details necessarily. It's more of a practical means to make sure that I get the shapes right and the right placements. So yeah, that's how I look at it. Of course, you can do whatever works for you. Everyone's a little different in that regard. Quick ad break. If you're enjoying that kind of process, be sure to check out my frustration-free watercolor course, where I show you how to loosen up, let go, and gain that freedom that I think everyone craves in watercolor painting and in art in general. And if you're more into creating realistic-looking paintings, check out the Watercolor Realism course. I think you'll love them both. Back to the video. So moving on with the petals, on the left we get all sorts of temperatures actually. We get some warms, we get some cools. The challenge will be as we open it up and reach those outer leaves that are a little more brown and green, that's where we'll start to vary up our mix. But right now I'm looking at my mix on the palette, and that's something that maybe will benefit some people. I'm looking at my mix as just one gray that I push towards a different color every time. So I'm adding a bit of blue, it goes towards the blue. I'm using the same mix. I'm adding to that mix a little bit yellow and red. I push it towards the orange, the warmth, whatever it is, right? And I'm using the same mix, same old mix, but I'm just adding and modifying it. And if you think about it in terms of yellow, blue, and red, it's actually quite simple. So yellows and blues will push it towards the warm, yellow and red push it toward the warm, blue pushes it towards the red. The more equal parts you add of all three, the grayer, cleaner gray it will become, the more it is in balance, okay? A lot of people don't add enough yellow, I find. A lot of people don't add enough red. Everyone has their own habits that you may want to look into and improve. But look at how already we're starting to get a really lovely three-dimensional impression here in how the petals are built, right? And all of these highlights that I'm leaving behind are quite important to tell us the story of the petals. The petals have this lovely pattern to them, some of which we will only be exposed to with the addition of the background, because there's a little bit of a white above the shadow. The petals curve like that, and they cast a shadow onto themselves on the top part, which is why you see some shadows on the top. But then once we add a background, you'll see there's a highlight above them, which is the part that curves and creates this beautiful, beautiful highlight. which is why I love these types of subjects. I find they actually lend themselves really well to beginners. Now, as we go down to the leaves that are more towards us, closer to us, you'll notice a lot more smooth transitions. So here, that's just something I want to think about. So I'm going to lay down a few glazes of paint. You'll see me do that in a second. And then I will very gently bring back some water in a damp, not wet, not soaking wet brush, and help them move along. A lot of these nuances of blue and yellow and so on, it doesn't really matter if you nail the exact color. It's more about the feel and how everything works together. Here we go, preparing for that smooth transition. I'm going to bring back some water and help the paint move. You'll notice I left a bit of a gap between the center of the leaf. That gap is a place for the paint to move into when I bring in more water. And then there's some dark on the right side of that petal, and I'm going to continue helping it smoothen out. But the colors, the matching itself doesn't have to be perfect. I'm going to introduce a bit of green now, so a bit of my French ultramarine and lemon yellow. It's more about the feel. And because we're using such a minimal palette, it will be fairly easy to have a consistent feel throughout the painting. It's not going to be too hard. Now, one thing that people get tricked by a lot, and that's green. Because when you look at these leaves around, you know they're green, but the problem is, and we'll get to them in a second, they're actually brown. If you match a color using Photoshop or any other app, there are a lot of free apps that allow you to do that. You swatch the color and you look at it for what it is on a white background. It's completely different sometimes than as it appears in the full context of the painting. This is actually very important. I don't think I ever really mentioned it this way. So when you look at the paint, that green for the leaves around it, it appears to be a green. You know it's a green, so your brain reads it as green, and it's very tempting to just mix a green and use it as a green. But when you swatch it, the actual color is a brown or a, some kind of a muted brown, orange, and when you place the correct, accurate color, very often it will make sense. So the color that intuitively you think is a different color, it's actually a brown, let's say, or some kind of a very muted green. It ends up working really well. So you see me now putting in just a green, because the edges are a little more green, and as I get to the center, what I'm going to do is add a lot of red to that mix. You'll see that in a second. So that and a lot of just more paint to get it darker, and you see it starts to neutralize, but still not enough. So look at what I'm going to do. I'm adding more red, more towards the orange brown, and now it starts to move in the correct direction. So placing the correct color will solve your problem, but it's tricky because sometimes it's hard to recognize. But once you place it on paper, it will feel right. And that's why sometimes when you place a green, it doesn't feel right. So just something to have in mind there. As it moves to the bottom, it gets a little more, I would say, just gray. So I am adding a bit more blue there. So it almost looks a little more like a muted green down the bottom. Now the left, look at how brown that is. If you swatch the color, I don't know exactly what it is because I haven't swatched it, but it has even hints of red to it around the bottom there, which is lovely. I love these kinds of nuanced greens that aren't actually green. Look at the stem. The stem is going to be really a nice little brown. And then it's on to move to the background, which is the part I kind of messed up, so I'll have to apologize for that. But let's get to it. Okay, so silly me hit the pause and then the re-record, and it didn't start recording again for the background. Super sorry. However, that's actually the simplest technique. So what I did was, and this is still wet, you can see it here in the camera, still wet paint. I cannot believe I didn't manage to capture that. My apologies. But again, this was a relatively simple technique. So what I did was, while this stem was still dry, I started painting this black background around here. And while this edge was still wet, I added the leaf in green, and I added this leaf in green, and I added that dark background. So I worked in shapes. So this is just like any other background that you see me paint, shape around it. As soon as I got to here, I rotated it to help the paint move down a bit. Okay, that's really important here because you want the paint to continue being as fresh as possible, right? This is super direct, so some freshness may be lost, ironically enough. But for the most part, I think this is a really good job. And then all the way around here, negatively painting around this edge that already was dry. So you get an almost soft transition on the right and harder harder transition and harder edge on the left, and the end result is what you see here, which is finally meaning to the highlight, right? As soon as you add a dark background, the highlights get their meaning. So thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed this one. Here is the final result once again, and apologies for that part that got cut out. Again, this is the simplest part. The hard part is figuring out, okay, how do I vary up the white shadows and all of that? But remember, nothing is hard if you know why you're doing it and you have some kind of a desire to reach a certain image. And even if the image you create does not match that, if the image is strong enough, eventually you will. Just a part of it. So keep honing that instinct, keep honing that ability, and you will make it there. I want to thank you so much. Once again, be sure to check out my courses in the description box below. I do want to take this opportunity to thank from the bottom of my heart to everyone who supports me over on Patreon. I'm just super grateful you allow me to do this for a living and to make art, which is the biggest gift. So thank you so much. I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care.